Making a Magic Harp. Written and read by Kyra Eliason. Chapter 1. The afternoon sun streamed through the window into her little attic room, warming it pleasantly and making the whole room feel bright and airy. It was a small room, but she'd made it hers, breaking up the wooden board of the floors and walls with cream and pink, curtains and bedspread acquired over years of small wages and meticulous hand-sewing. Elora tucked her wings in close, not wanting to ruin the magic she was working with a stray feather or breeze. She'd been working on this for too long to ruin it now. Not now when it was so close. Just 5 more strings. She took the braid, carefully woven of 7 strands of long golden hair, just exactly as long as she needed. The hair had been a gift. She'd asked for it, but that made it no less a gift, as no payment had been asked in return. She tied one end very carefully at the top of the harp, pulling it taut, but not too tight, and fastened the other end. Very gently she plucked each string she had so far, soft, sweet tones filling her little space. She listened carefully, tuning the new one to the right note. "Elora!" a familiar voice called, and she quickly threw her blanket over the unfinished harp, dusting her hands off on her apron as if there were evidence on them that might show what she'd been doing. She ran out of the room, shutting the door very quietly and turning to the side so it would look more like she'd been passing by, not that she'd been inside. "Coming!" Elora called, trying to hit that tone between eager to please and calm, without guilt over having been away from her place. "Oh, good. I've been looking for you for ages. You're needed in the library," the matron of the first-year class said, a bit sternly, as Elora reached her. Elora hid her worry. "Yes, ma'am. I'll go there right away." If it was first years, they'd probably gone and made a mess of all the books. Again. It seemed no one properly respected the library until they'd been studying at least a full year. But since the school accepted new students yearly, Elora had to deal with an assortment of people that believed "student" meant they didn't have to clean up behind themselves. Well, it was at least possible she could get another gift for finishing the harp. She'd have used her own hair, but it was too short, a pale, tan-colored fluff more like down than hair anymore, and wasn't good for any but the first few smallest strings, even after braiding. And anyway, the magic she was trying to imbue the harp with always seemed to work best with a variety of gifts. She ran down into the library, her wings fanning out for balance and tucking in so she could get through the door. She didn't expect someone to be standing directly in front of the door, and her wings shot out instinctively to break, one of them smacking into the door, making it bang against the wall very loudly. She winced as every eye in the room was drawn to her abrupt entrance. She really shouldn't have tried to run in. The man she'd nearly crashed into was a wizard, old, with long robes and thick glasses. He was a frequent visitor of the library, sometimes staying for hours at a time. His eyes were wide, blinking at her with a hand on his chest. She tucked in her wings quickly, with a very small, "Sorry." "She's cursed," one of the first years murmured. Elora fluffed up in indignation, looking around the wizard to try and see who had said it. "It's a blessing!" The man set a hand on her head, which, on top of everything else, seemed incredibly condescending. "It's all right, dear. They're young and foolish." "Yes," she bit out, "they are." She walked off into the shelves of books, leaving them all behind. Of course, there was a wave of whispers as she left their line of sight, but she genuinely didn't want to hear them. Her cheeks burned with both embarrassment and anger, and she avoided the eyes of anyone she could see, just picking up books and scrolls that were out of place and collecting them onto the cart, ready for putting away later when there were less rude people milling around the library. They left her alone for a while, which she appreciated, still upset that they whispered and judged her, but glad that they at least had enough sense not to bother her directly. She carried another armful of books back to the cart, and there was a boy standing beside it, watching her silently. She ignored him, stubbornly keeping her gaze averted for several trips back and forth, but finally the cart was full, and she frowned rather grumpily at him. "What?" He looked down and shuffled awkwardly. He was young, younger than most first years that were accepted, with curly black hair and dark skin that contrasted with the light gray of the first-year robes. "Sorry, it can wait if you're busy." Elora sighed and made an effort to relax her frown. "No, go ahead. What is it?" He lifted the book in his arms. This references the Chronicles of Epilogue, and I wanted to try and find them." Elora thought for a moment. "Ah, I remember. That one always used to catch me, too. Epilogue went and called what is more technically a diary his Chronicles. Since they don't record any historical events, only his own experiments and homemade spells and various musings, they aren't categorized by the library with the other Chronicles. Look in the personal writings shelves. It'll be under C or I." The boy nodded, his expression empty other than a politeness he seemed to exude. "Thank you. Are you a student here too, then?" Elora blinked and nearly blushed. "Oh, no, I'm not. But since I work in the library, I'm allowed to read the books, and the Chronicles of Epilogue are pretty well known." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "For all your teachers will tell you he was eccentric and dangerously experimental, he's influenced many great users of magic." The boy nodded again, slowly, his dark eyes wide. Not able to resist, Elora lowered her tone further, leaning in a bit more. "Often, experimenting on your own will get you better results than the kinds of spells they teach you in class. But you didn't hear that from me." He nodded a third time, his face solemn, but a spark of curiosity plain in his eyes. Elora stood straight again and grinned. "Well, off you go. If you can't find it after a while, come back and I'll help you." He scurried off, headed right for the correct section. Elora went back to her book collecting, feeling much better than she had previously. Eventually, the first-year class moved on to their next class, and she was able to replace the books to their proper places in peace. The other staff of the library didn't badger her to keep her wings tucked up out of the way, like visitors sometimes did, and it was nice to be able to let them rest or flare out as was comfortable when there were only a few roaming people in the library. She slid the last scroll into its round slot and smiled. Unless there was a stack of returned books waiting at the front desk, she should be done. She hadn't gotten any hair, though, which was a shame. Perhaps she could see if there was anyone else she could ask. Most of the teachers or professors didn't care for her, certainly not enough to gift her anything. The cursed reputation always ran ahead of her. They acted like she was a charity case, as if letting her work here was in itself a tremendous favor, and especially they considered her wages to be of the utmost generosity on the behalf of the school, which absolved them of any at all guilt about refusing her requests. But perhaps another of the staff. They liked her a bit better. Surely there was someone she hadn't yet asked. She went outside, wandering a bit in the gathering dusk. Perhaps the groundskeeper would have hired another helper. He never could seem to keep enough workers. A few explosions and tramplings of a carefully tended flower bed from inexperienced magic users was enough to make many quit. She knocked on the greenhouse door, knowing that the groundskeeper tended to visit here just before dinner time to make sure no one was hiding inside before he locked it up for the night. "You'll want to be careful with this one," she heard him saying to someone. "When transplanted, it tries to root immediately, and if you aren't using something it can't root through, like a metal pail, you'll end up with a stuck plant rather than an uprooted one." He chuckled lightly. "And no one wants to be the one stuck with a woven basket now firmly filled with acetyl." Elora turned the corner to see the groundskeeper, Mr. Ritter, and a woman close to her own age. They were both smiling and chatting amiably. Despite herself, Elora couldn't help but notice the waist-length, shiny black hair. But quickly she turned her attention away from that. It wasn't fair to anyone to be seen only for what someone wanted from them. The woman was short and fat, with dark brown skin and beautifully dark eyes. She wasn't wearing a student uniform, but Elora didn't want to assume too much. She had a bright smile and an even brighter feel to her whole person. And then she looked past the groundskeeper at Elora, who couldn't help a moment of "pretty person noticing me" panic before she managed a small smile and wave. "Ah, Elora, nice to see you," Mr. Ritter said, his voice warm and gravelly. "This is Asha. She's here as how did you say it? Similar to an apprentice?" Asha smiled pleasantly. "I'm here to study plants, especially magical plants. I get to learn and stay here in exchange for helping out on the grounds." Elora brightened. "Oh, that's similar to what I do. I'm working in the library." The groundskeeper gave a short nod, clearly pleased with himself. "I figured the two of you would get along. Why don't you join us for dinner, Elora? We can be done with instruction for tonight." Elora nodded. "I'd love to join you." The groundskeeper led the way out, locking the door behind them, and Asha came to walk beside Elora. "So how's the library? I haven't seen it yet, but I imagine in an academy like this it must be impressive," Asha said, and even her voice was pretty, smooth and low with a slight accent. "Oh, it is," Elora said excitedly. "It's not as large as you might think, but it has so many books and scrolls on magic and magical items and spells, and really almost everything in the library that isn't a book or a shelf actually is a magical item." "Oh, that sounds amazing! What kinds of magical items?" Asha's eyes were bright, and she looked so genuinely interested that Elora felt both at ease and excited. "Well, there's a massive globe, and if you have enough knowledge of a place, it'll turn itself to point out that place for you. It's said that ancient lost civilizations were found by using it." "Wow," Asha said. "That must be incredibly helpful." Encouraged by this, Elora went on. "There's a set of quills made from magical feathers that you can use to write as quickly as you can think, though you certainly have to be careful not to let your thoughts wander. And there's a certain shelf that has all the round slots for scrolls, but the scrolls are empty, and if you take one when the shelf is mostly full, it'll somehow make a new one by itself. And it might be a little mundane, but there's a stepladder that moves itself, so if you have to get a shelf or two over, you can without climbing all the way down and back up again. It's very useful when putting away lots of books." Elora suddenly realized she was rambling and quickly closed her mouth. "Those sound brilliant," Asha said, "and very useful in a library. Did you give some of your feathers for the quells?" Oh no, my feathers wouldn't do anything nearly as impressive as that. They're quite mundane," Elora said, suddenly a bit disappointed in her own feathers for not being any more noteworthy. Asha nodded, still somehow looking interested. "How did you get to have feathers? Were you born with them?" And that was a bit of a touchy subject for Elora. "Well, it was I think it was a failed spell, though I'm not certain. But it's become a blessing to me. I love my wings, and my hair, and I wouldn't part with them even if I knew how." Asha smiled. "They're certainly beautiful, and I apologize if I pried too much." They'd reached the groundskeeper's house, somehow having walked all that way during the short, or at least to Elora it seemed short, talk. She tucked her wings in close to get through the door. "Oh, it's all right," she said, any lingering discomfort soothed by the compliment. "It's a rather obvious question." "Oh, lovely. Dinner's been made already," the groundskeeper said jovially, crossing the room to his wife and kissing her. "Thank you, dear. We have another guest I didn't mention. Will there be enough, or should I bring in some fruit?" "Oh, there's plenty for Elora, too," Mrs. Ritter said, smiling across at Elora. "It's always nice to have you for dinner." "Thank you, Mrs. Ritter," Elora said with a smile. She liked Mrs. Ritter. Her home was always open to Elora, a calm and cozy place away from the bustle and problems of the students. Mrs. Ritter had made a large, layered salad, filled with fruits and berries and chicken, and probably at least 4 different kinds of greens. Elora really didn't know that much about plants, and just listened, very intrigued, as Asha and Mrs. Ritter discussed what all went into the salad, where it was from, and why it had been added. At the very end of it, Elora felt a bit bewildered, but thoroughly convinced that the salad was as good for her as it was tasty. "So, Elora, how's your secret project been coming?" Mrs. Ritter asked, doling out something delicious-smelling that looked like a cobbler. Asha also looked to Elora, who was reminded that she would very much like a few strands of Asha's hair to continue working with, and also wasn't sure, even with this convenient mention of it, how to ask. "Yes, I'd love to know," Mr. Ritter said. "Oh, it's going well. I'm very close to done. Just a few more steps," Elora said, a touch dismissively, thinking the topic would end there. "What is it?" Asha asked. "Oh, but if it's a secret, sorry. Good luck, though." Elora chuckled a bit awkwardly. It is a secret, but only until it's done. Once I'm finished, if it works, I'd be happy to show you." Here she was, barely having met Asha, and already willing to show her the harp that would surely get her in trouble if news about it went around. But then Asha smiled, dispelling Elora's worries. "I'd love to see it. Is it magical?" Elora nodded immediately. "Yes, it is, and actually—" Awkwardness set in abruptly and uncomfortably. Well, you can obviously say no, but, it uses hair to make. Would it have an effect on me if you used some of mine? Asha asked, thankfully cutting off the rest of Ellara's stumbling request. She wasn't sure why it was so much more difficult to ask Asha. Perhaps because she'd only newly met her? But other students at the school she'd never spoken to before were easy. Just a quick, "I'm making a magical item. Could I have a bit of your hair?" It was probably that Asha was pretty. And nice. She always felt awkward around pretty people. "Oh, no, it wouldn't affect you, or it's not supposed to, at least. Other than you not having the hair anymore, I mean." Ellara's face was getting warm. "I don't mind, then." Asha smiled, all bright and sweet, and Ellara couldn't have resisted smiling back even if she'd been trying. Her embarrassment melted. "Does it matter if it's cut?" Asha asked, pulling a small pair of green-stained scissors out of a pouch on her hip. Ellara shook her head. "No, it just matters that it's freely given." Asha pulled a lock of hair from the back of her head and snipped it close to the scalp, winding it into a small skein and holding it out to Ellara. "Here you go. Freely given. Though I really would like to see what it helps make." Ellara nodded immediately. "Yes, of course I'll show you. Thank you." "No problem. I have plenty." Ellara probably hadn't stopped smiling since before dinner, but she smiled a bit wider, and then realized she should probably head back to her own room. She didn't want to be rude to the Ritters, and they'd already let her eat dinner with them unexpectedly. "Well, I won't impose for any longer. Thank you so much for inviting me to dinner." "You're very welcome," Mrs. Ritter said kindly. "Feel free to come over any time. We don't get visitors very often." The groundskeeper nodded, getting up from his chair. "I could walk out with you to the main building." "Oh, thank you, but I'll be fine," Ellara said. "And it was really nice to meet you, Asha." "It was nice to meet you, too. I hope we run into each other again soon." Ellara smiled and nodded, and then got up. Mr. Ritter opened the door for her and watched after her as she walked away. It was several minutes of walking back to the main building, and it was rather dark by now, but the moonlight was enough to see by, and the stars were beautiful. She felt light and full, like she could do a spin just for the joy of existing on such a pretty night as this. She didn't actually spin, but walked back slowly and meanderingly, looking up at the stars rather than paying attention to her steps. When she finally got back to her room, she had to consider carefully. Light one of her last 3 candles, and work on the harp by candlelight, or wait and try to sneak away again in the afternoon tomorrow to do it then. Though she did get paid in 5 days. She'd be able to afford a few more candles if she waited until the next payday to get a new apron. She could probably try again to sew up the big pocket, which was dangling open now. She needed it since it was invaluable for carrying books when she wasn't able to use her hands, or for scrolls. But her sewing skills weren't exactly the strongest, despite all her attempts and practice, and the other times she'd sewn the pocket back up, it had only been a few days before it had ripped open under the weight of the books again. Perhaps she could ask someone else to sew it up for her? At that thought she was decided. She lit the candle and unwound the hair, measuring it against the size of the harp. It was more than long enough. She would only have to braid 3 hairs together, not worry about carefully splicing more hairs into the braid to make it reach. She lined up 3 hairs and set the candlestick on top of the ends, tying them together, and then carefully and evenly braiding them all the way down. The braid was so fine with only 3 strands that the braiding took time. Actually stringing the harp needed more than a flickering candle, so she carefully put the braid away and started on a second. She could make 4 braids and have 1 last strand of hair if she didn't break any, and with 1 strand of hair long enough, it would be so much easier to splice hair into a braid for that last strand. She could possibly even use her own, and wouldn't that be rather fitting, to have her own hair be a part of the first and last strings? She stayed up a few more hours, very carefully braiding. Her own hair may have been a fitting idea, but splicing that many times to get a long enough strand took a very long time. But finally, she had them. Everything she needed. She could finish her harp tomorrow. Chapter 2. Ellara jerked awake, a thought prodding her mind insistently. It was important. Today was important, and she had to be sure to wake up on time. But why? She looked around the room, hoping for clues. Perhaps she'd left herself a note. She was usually good at remembering to do that if the event was important enough. She was pretty certain it wasn't a holiday or a new class coming. But then what was it? And then she saw the strings laid out beside her unfinished harp. Excitement sparked, tingling on her tongue and sending a thrill of urgency through her. She had to move, and do it now. Elora jumped up from her bed, running to the harp, her fingers hovering over it, afraid to touch lest in her excitement she break or drop it. "Elora!" a voice called, landing heavy like a wet blanket over her sparking excitement. Elora let out a heavy sigh. Of course she would be needed early today, when she was so close. She stared a few more moments at the nearly finished harp, resigning herself to the necessary further waiting. "I'm coming!" she called out the door. She folded a paper swiftly around the strings and placed them and the unfinished harp under her pillow, flinging the blanket over the bed and hoping it looked uninteresting. She grabbed her work apron, tying it on and jogging down the stairs. Whoever had called her seemed to be gone, but Millie was there. Millie was an acquaintance, a maid in the school. She might have been a friend, except that Elora usually had at least one secret, and Millie's tongue was known throughout the school. She knew of everything that went on, and seemed incapable of keeping any scrap of knowledge to herself. "What's going on?" Elora asked her. Millie glanced around and lowered her voice, setting her broom against the wall. "I think there were some students that tried making potions by themselves last night." Elora put a hand over her mouth. "They didn't test them on themselves, surely?" Millie nodded solemnly. "Are they all right?" "Not so loud." "Shh, I think so." "They made a royal mess of the library trying to find a cure for whatever it was they did." Millie offered a sympathetic grimace. Elora nodded slowly, and then remembered some of the other things that would happen that day. "And Professor Everard is going to be coming at 9, all grumpy if it's still a mess." She groaned. "Dear, that'll be a lot of work. I'll go there now. Save me something from breakfast, will you?" Millie nodded, turning back to the kitchens and nearly forgetting her broom. Elora hurried down to the library, groaning as she looked around. It was such a mess. Scrolls were flung everywhere, unrolled or in piles, mixed with books splayed open. There was even a whole bookshelf knocked over, and several haphazard piles of books on the floor, most likely a frenzied student collecting everything remotely related to the subject and flipping through each one looking for a cure. She felt bad for the students, especially the ones that had had poorly made potions applied to them, but she was also annoyed. She wasn't even properly studying magic, and she knew better than to apply any kind of spell or potion to herself. Even the witch that had changed her had known that. She sighed heavily, and then tried to find a good place to start. Probably the fallen bookshelf. She eyed it for a few minutes, trying to figure out how she was going to do it. Finally, she picked out a spot, working her fingers under the edge in a gap that was there because of a book the shelf had landed on. She lifted, and once she had managed to get it above waist level, she flapped her wings hard, using the propulsion forward and up to get the shelf back to a standing position. Now to gather all those scattered books and scrolls into piles. There were far too many to fit in the library cart. She worked as quickly as she could, and soon everything looked a lot better, though she knew well that the neat-looking stacks of books would take ages to sort and properly put away. "Hello," someone said brightly just behind her. Elora jolted, spinning around, her wings flaring out instinctively, and she very nearly hit Asha in the face with them. "Oh, sorry." Asha winced apologetically. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I was just happy to find you here when I came." Elora tucked her wings back in, feeling just as apologetic as Asha, and a little embarrassed. "It's all right, and I almost hit you." Asha smiled and chuckled slightly. "They look so soft, I don't think I would have minded, even if you did." Elora suddenly felt her cheeks get very warm. Even of people that liked her, no one ever complimented her wings. Thank you. What did you come for?" Asha looked rather amused at Elora's fluster, which was very unfair when she'd been the one to cause it. "I was told to look for a certain book. Mr. Ritter said it would help me work from plants I already know to learn about new ones. It's called The Botany of Travel, a plant's eye view of the world and how to traverse it." Elora thought for a while. "I don't know that one particularly, but I do know where to start looking." As much as she wanted to go with Asha, she knew she didn't have any time. When the first classes that were actually meant to be invading the library arrived, it would need to be at least mostly clean, with books and scrolls in their proper places. If you go over that way, Elora directed with an open-handed gesture, there's a few shelves on magical plant life. You should try the right side of the leftmost one. For half a second, Asha looked as disappointed as Elora felt at having to leave her to look alone, but her expression smoothed quickly into an appreciative smile. Thank you. Perhaps this evening, whenever you aren't busy, we could talk again? Elora felt all warm at this clear indication that Asha really did want to spend more time with her. That would be great. I'll try to get out maybe a bit before dusk, unless you'd be busy then? That'd be fine, Asha said, and her eyes crinkled up as she smiled in the prettiest way. If you want, I can bring a blanket and we could have a picnic dinner. That sounds amazing, Elora said, hopefully not looking dumb and puppy-eyed. She could feel her feathers fluffing up and could only pray it wasn't too obvious. I can bring the food then. Asha nodded and stepped once to the side. I'll see you then. Elora waved as Asha walked away, feeling almost lightheaded. She finally tore her eyes away from that section of the library and started sorting through one of the stacks of books, habit taking over the process, as her mind was still whirling far above her. Fantasies of fireflies and picnics and smells of green things and spices, of dark skin and flashing smiles and sweet words that warmed her to her core. Somehow she finished before Professor Everard arrived with the first class of the day, though how she'd organized and put away so many things in the short time she didn't remember at all. She slipped away from the library to eat some breakfast, trying to settle back down to earth and properly consider things like the rest of her day and how she was going to get food for a picnic dinner. She didn't exactly want to show up with the same dinner as the students, crammed into some kind of carrying container, but she didn't know what other options she had. She might have to talk to the cook, which was tricky. Wings and being easily startled didn't exactly mesh with a busy and chaotic kitchen. Or perhaps she could have Millie ask for her? No, Millie would be too curious about why, and would tease once she knew, or at least spread the story, and then several people would tease, or even worse. She was absurdly giddy about something as small as having a picnic dinner, and it wasn't even like it meant anything. Except that it did, to her. At the very least, it meant that Asha liked her as a person, and perhaps, if she could hope, after tonight she might like her as a friend. It was a new feeling, to be liked so genuinely and obviously so soon. She knew she shouldn't get her hopes up, especially since Asha would be leaving someday, but she'd always wanted a really, really close friend, someone to talk to and to listen back, to lay together beneath the clouds or the stars, someone to hug for longer than the few seconds of a greeting, to hold hands with, someone to be very close with in several different ways. It seemed possible now to have this dream at last fulfilled. And she liked Asha a lot, very quickly. It scared her a little, to be honest. She was hoping for the possibility of this close relationship with Asha already, and she'd barely even met her. It was her own mind, flying so far ahead, that was causing the problems. She needed to back up and slow down. It was just a picnic dinner. Yes, it meant that Asha enjoyed spending time with her and wanted to spend even more time, and that was still very exciting. But it didn't mean more than that. She needed to calm herself. She took a deep breath and set aside her empty plate. Now she just had to figure out how she was getting dinner and when she was going to do her rounds of the library. She had to be careful to seem to be present whenever the professors came through, and had to be sure that the library would stay clean and organized. It shouldn't be too hard. She was good at slipping away and getting back before anyone noticed she was gone, which she really should do now. She'd been gone a while. She put the empty plate back where Millie had left it, rather than properly in the dirty dishes bin, leaving open the possibility of returning it as an excuse to go into the kitchens and talk to the cook later. Hopefully no one had made a mess in the library while she was eating. Elora opened the library door, slipping in and then just staring, an exasperated sigh escaping her. It was first years again. For some reason, there was a good half of the class pulling out books and leaving them open on tables without a teacher to be seen, and she didn't have the authority to stop them. Not only was she not the librarian, just an assistant, but she was also seen as cursed by everyone, which seemed to give them all permission to ignore her, or worse. She just had to wait and clean up the best she could while they were here and once they left. It was incredibly frustrating. But then she saw the same young boy as she'd helped the day before, head bent over a book at a short distance from most of the rest of the students. He'd been polite. Perhaps she could at least learn why they were trashing her library without supervision. "Hey," she said quietly, not wanting to startle him from his intent reading. He looked up, his head jerking up on instinct before his eyes left the page. Elora smiled slightly. He would do well here if he could get past a few years of bullies. "Oh, hello." He didn't seem embarrassed, or like he felt caught in the act of anything. Perhaps the students actually were allowed to be in here? She waved slightly. "I was wondering what your class is doing here. It isn't on the schedule." He blinked, a slight furrow of confusion appearing between his brows. "Oh, my class. Yes, we're, just going off schedule today." Elora was immediately suspicious. "Is that so? Which teacher approved that?" The boy stammered some kind of nonsense, slowly flushing a shade darker. "I forgot her name?" Elora nodded, trying to hide her amused smile. "You aren't a part of the class, are you?" He froze, looking very obviously trapped. Elora didn't know exactly what was going on, but she decided, at least for now, to cut the kid a break and propose an easy story. "Look, if you're being tutored one-on-one, you can just say so. Bullies might think you're stuck up or rich and snobby, but not everyone will, and they'd bully you for anything else, too. It's fine, I can ask another student what the class is doing." The boy's mouth dropped open. Yes, I am being tutored. Sorry I couldn't help you." Elora nodded. "It's all right, I'll ask someone else." The boy let out a too loud sigh of relief as she left. For someone sneaking in on classes, he was far too obvious. Though she could certainly understand not being able to pay tuition. It certainly wasn't a cheap school. She tapped another student on the shoulder, one who was laying out the 5th open book on a table. She put on her most professional, intimidating voice. "Excuse me, but what are you all doing?" The student spun around wide-eyed, and then sighed with relief upon seeing who she was. "We're just looking up things." Elora put her hands on her hips, narrowing her eyes. "What kinds of things?" "Why should I tell you?" he snapped. Elora raised an eyebrow. "Because then maybe I won't report you to the professors." The student glared. "Oh, fine. We're trying to figure out what that one girl did to herself, because once she undid it, she threw up gold." Elora openly grimaced. "That can't be good for her insides." The student shrugged. "She seems fine." They were really trying to recreate it. Elora spun around. She was absolutely reporting this. "Hey, wait!" the student yelled. All eyes turned at the shout. For a moment, no one moved, and the library was completely silent. Elora felt frozen under the many stares. "She's gonna tell!" the student yelled, pointing at her. Elora ran. Instantly she was mobbed by the students. She flung her wings open, flapping at them all, and they backed away for a second. Elora half ran, half flew to the doorway, ducking through and racing away. The crowd of students pressed after her, footsteps thundering closer as they chased. She had been here longer than any of them, and she knew several of the hidden passages and strange intersections. There was one, if she could just reach it, with magical invisible stairs. She couldn't walk on them, only the wizards could, but the hallway they came from, if she could get up to it, would take her to safety. The other end of the hallway opened far across the school, in the middle of the teachers' rooms, where the students wouldn't dare to go. And they certainly wouldn't have a way of reaching the near end without magic that was years beyond their level. The biggest question, though, was, could she make the jump? She didn't practice flying often at all. She didn't have nearly enough time, and her wing muscles were nowhere near enough to support her in the air. But she'd made this jump, assisted by her wings, 3 times before. The most recent had been a good month ago, though, unhurried and without an audience, and she had still nearly fallen then. But maybe she could. She spun around the corner, cursing her own slowness and lack of stamina as she felt something brush her wing, which meant they were close enough to try grabbing. She pushed herself to run a bit faster, knowing she had to make one more turn to the left, and then she had to make it along that hall, which would hopefully be empty, and then as soon as she got into the open intersection she had to jump and leave maneuvering till the last second. Height would be by far the most important. She grabbed the corner of the wall and pulled herself into the left turn so she wouldn't have to slow down, running as fast as she could down that last hallway. There it was. She ran out into the open area, spreading her wings and flapping hard, jumping up into the air as high as she could. Behind her, however many of the students that were still chasing shouted something she didn't pay any attention to. She was just trying for height and power, and wasn't able to aim. She crashed half into the side of the opening, only barely managing to twist into the second-story hallway rather than falling backward nearly 10 feet to the ground. She gasped for air, pain pulsing dully along her right side as her vision tunneled and became dark and blurry. She couldn't pass out. She'd gotten herself somewhere they couldn't reach, but they'd be able to find a way around to her, or a ladder, or something, if she gave them enough time. They were still shouting something, but all her attention was focused on breathing in and out. She couldn't tell and didn't care what they were saying. "Oh dear," someone said, very close to her, and she managed to languidly turn her gaze towards them. It was the single one of the professors that would actually talk to her, a very old wizard named Azar, who taught the 5th-year class, stooping over her low enough that his white beard brushed her arm. "What's going on here? I wouldn't have thought you were the type for dares, Elora." "Dares?" She slowly began to register some of the words from below. They must have seen Azar before she did, and were explaining that they'd dared her to try and make the jump, but that she'd missed partially, and how proud they were of how close she'd been. The liars. If she could just manage to get enough breath back to say something. Elora just managed to shake her head, feeling more than a little dizzy, but still trying to communicate. "You all go back to your class," Azar said. "I'll take Elora and make sure she's checked by one of the healers." There was a sound of footsteps going away, and Azar mumbled some kind of spell, which made Elora feel weightless, and made her even more dizzy. She closed her eyes, pain and vertigo chasing each other around within her. At least she was able to breathe a little easier now. "I'm glad to see you making friends with the students, but really you ought to be more careful," Azar chided, making a motion over her that lifted her slightly and made her move towards him. Elora floated along a few inches above the ground until they'd made it back to Azar's office and she was laid on the couch. "See if you can sit up, and here's some water," Azar offered gently, holding out a cup in one hand with his other ready to help steady her. Elora carefully sat up, and pain exploded behind her eyes. She winced, groaning and curling in on herself. The cup was put into her hands, and Azar set a hand gently on her head. It took a few minutes, but slowly the pain faded away. "Thank you," Elora finally said, opening her eyes and taking a sip of her water. "You're welcome. Though you still have quite a bump on your head. I'd be careful of that if I were you." Azar stood up and started walking back to his desk. Elora nodded, suddenly remembering. "Oh, the students! They're trying to recreate what happened to another student this morning. I was coming to report them, and that's why they were chasing me." Azar looked at her grimly. "You're certain? You haven't hit your head too hard?" "I'm very sure," Elora interrupted. "They hadn't found the recipe yet when I left, but they were all in the library, about half of the 1st-year class." Azar stroked his long beard thoughtfully. "That kind of idiocy does sound apropos of the 1st-year class. I'll speak with some other teachers. We'll look into it. You can stay here and rest." Elora slumped back against the couch in relief. Azar turned toward the door, and then turned back. "You say those 3 were chasing you?" Elora wasn't sure about how many exactly had kept chasing all the way to the end, but she nodded. "I think most of them stopped chasing once I made it out of the library." Azar nodded again, slow and thoughtful, stroking his beard again. "I see. I'll return shortly." Once he left, Elora laid down. All the adrenaline was fading, and she felt sore and exhausted, but at least she'd reported it. Whatever trouble the students got in would be far less harmful than something like poisoning themselves and throwing up gold. An old gray cat slunk out from under the couch. He was probably nearly as old as Azar was, and Elora was pretty certain that he was a familiar too, not just a cat, which made her like him a lot. It made them a bit similar. She held out a hand to the cat, and he sniffed at her fingers, eyeing her again before jumping up onto the couch. Elora closed her eyes, and the cat kneaded into her side, sharp claws pricking into her. "Ow, don't," she whined, squinting one eye open to pout at the cat. His tail swished, and he kneaded again. She didn't want to knock the cat off of her, but she was too tired to do more than weakly bat at him, which he just sidestepped, settling onto her knees and kneading with his claws out. He very rudely kept her from napping the entire time until Azar returned. Azar held out a small container to her, which turned out to be filled with a cold potato salad. I've brought you some lunch. Thank you for reporting them. We arrived just before they put a very dangerous spell onto one student, who would have been extremely sorry to have agreed with them. As one of several punishments, those students will be cleaning the library for you until the last color of your bruise fades, and then you will be receiving a written apology." Elora nodded. "Thank you. I'm glad they're all okay." "As am I. I'll have to get back to my own class now, but you're welcome to stay in my office as long as you like." "Thank you." "Thank you, Elora." Azar bowed slightly towards her. The cat jumped from the couch up to Azar's shoulder, and then Azar left again. Elora sighed in relief, glad to have it all over. She took the food with her and walked slowly back to her room to eat there. And then she saw her own face in a mirror, mottled black and blue with a massive bruise on her forehead and a smaller but still very ugly one on her right cheek. She winced and let out a long groan as she realized Asha was going to see her looking like this in the evening. Chapter 3. Elora had tried everything she could, but her face was still sore and puffy, and she knew from another time passing a mirror that it looked terrible. She groaned hopelessly. Why did she have to go and hit a wall? If she'd just aimed a little better, she would be fine. She'd made it high enough. And now she looked terrible, and didn't know how she was going to cover it up before the evening. She'd tried what she could, holding cold things gently to her face, and surely Azar's magic had helped too, but it hadn't done nearly enough. Finally, she just decided to hope desperately that Asha wouldn't mention it, and work on getting some dinner for them both. And maybe it would work in her favor a little. The cook might pity her and be willing to make something, or at least let her make something. The kitchen wasn't quite bustling yet. The rush to make dinner would begin in perhaps an hour, but the cook was still there, as well as 2 assistants. Elora knocked lightly on the side of the open door. The cook turned and dropped the bunch of herbs she'd been holding, shock and horror plain on her face. "Good heavens! What's happened to you?" Elora opened her mouth to speak, but the cook grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the kitchen, setting her on a stool. "Dear, this is awful," the cook said softly, inspecting Elora's face. "I'll make you a poultice. Go on now, you can tell me." Elora felt oddly hesitant. The cook's sudden intensity directed towards helping her was a bit overwhelming, especially when she thought the cook disliked her. Some students were chasing me." "They what?" the cook interrupted loudly, faced away from Elora and pulling things out of a cabinet. "Don't tell me they hurt you. Any student, I don't care how much tuition they pay, if they would hurt one of the staff like that, they ought to be expelled." "No, they didn't. I was concerned they might, but that isn't what happened." Elora looked down at her hands in her lap, a bit embarrassed to admit she'd run into the wall on her own. The cook laid out several root vegetables on the counter, cutting and crushing quickly. "Then what did happen?" "Well, you know the staircase the professors use sometimes?" Elora asked. "Magic one. I know it. Uncanny thing." The cook shook her head, still focused on turning the vegetables nearly to paste. "I tried to jump up to the hallway to get away, and I missed." The cook turned to look at her, a half-sympathetic, half-judgmental grimace on her face. "Even with wings, that's a gamble to jump to." Elora nodded, looking down into her lap again. The cook scraped a chunky paste of vegetables off the cutting board and into a small pot, and hung it over the fire. "Still, it seems you made it away from whatever mischief the students had planned." Elora nodded again. The cook stirred the pot quickly, frowning at it intently. It began to smell strongly of onions. Barely a minute later, she took it off the fire and poured it into a cheesecloth, tying it into a bag. "Hold this to your face, dear. It'll help the color lighten. It might have been better if you'd come to me sooner, but it'll still help." Her tone was somewhere between caring and scolding. It felt almost motherly, which was a very strange feeling. Elora did as she said, the soft bag pleasantly warm, though pungent. She realized then that she would be going to meet Asha not only with her face all mottled, but also smelling like onions. For the cook's sake, she forced herself not to grimace, but the thought was nearly painful. "Now what was it you came for?" the cook asked. "I'd intended to have a picnic this evening," Elora said, "and I'd still like to try. I wanted to ask you if you could help me with making food." The cook winced, looking at her face. "I'm guessing the plan was to meet someone?" Elora nodded slowly, the woman's pity making her own chest feel heavier. Perhaps you ought to ask them to meet another day, or send a messenger to ask for you, the cook suggested, in a gentler tone than Elora had thought her capable of. I don't want to miss it, Elora said hesitantly, blinking as she began to tear up. She really didn't want to miss it, but it felt almost like it was ruined already. The cook sighed. I can understand you. I was young too once. I'd still suggest you try to put it off, but if you're determined, I'll help you with the food. Elora smiled gratefully, her chin dimpling. Thank you. The cook gave her a half-smile that was more pitying than anything else. Once that cools completely, it'll have done what it could. Elora nodded, shifting the bag up a bit and trying to blink away the tears that were threatening to spill. So why were the students chasing you? One of the cook's assistants asked. While Elora started over the story, telling all the details, the cook made her up a basket of some extremely tasty-looking food. Small sandwiches and little containers of cold salads, some fruit and cheese. Elora watched with increasingly wide eyes as the cook kept adding to the basket. It was far more than she had even hoped for. She doubted that she and Asha would even be able to eat it all. All right, here you are, the cook said, unmistakably proud, holding the basket out to Elora. I hope you have a good evening, and that this person is worth every bit of this basket. Thank you so much, Elora said, reaching out for the basket. But the cook pulled it back suddenly. You can have it, if you promise me that if this person you're meeting is anything other than kind to you, you'll walk away and keep it all for your own self. Elora blinked. She'd never had anyone be protective over her this way, and was surprised now. The cook probably didn't even know her name. She certainly didn't know the cook's name. And here she'd been so kind to her. Yes, I promise. The cook nodded firmly, handing her the basket. Then go off and have fun. I'll need the space in here. It's almost time to make dinner. Elora nodded quickly and scurried off with her basket, still marveling at the whole experience. She wondered if it was too early to go on outside. Thanks to the students, she didn't have any more library work, and not much else to do before the picnic. Well, perhaps if she went out early, the breeze might blow away some of the stink of the poultice, and she could at least try to wash it off. There was a trickling little stream that meandered around the school property, and near a bend of it would be a pleasant place to picnic. She was getting nervous the more she thought about it, a heavy rock settling in her stomach. What if she showed up and Asha laughed at her? Or was disgusted by the smell and couldn't stand to stay? Or she stayed for the picnic but then just quietly avoided her? What if it had all been politeness so far, and after this Asha felt like she'd met the need to be social and didn't really care for Elora at all? She couldn't know, she tried to tell herself, but she shouldn't think bad things of Asha. She should try to be optimistic and hope for the best. She pushed all the nervous thoughts aside, going outside and heading straight for the bend in the stream. She set the basket down and washed her face and neck, trying to clean everywhere the poultice had touched. There was a small, smooth bit of water where a rock blocked it from flowing down, and she tried to see her reflection. The bruise looked not as bad. She was rather bedraggled looking, though, with her damp hair. Being a bit feathery, it looked even stranger wet than it normally did, plastered together and limp. Elora tried to dry and fluff her hair again, letting out an almost tearful sigh. Everything she'd tried to look a little more presentable had made something else worse. And she was already... She took in a deep, calming breath. No, she wouldn't think that way. Her wings and hair and everything were all a blessing, and she loved them. She was beautiful, even if today wasn't the best for showing it. Elora! Elora looked up to see Asha in the distance, holding a wide pan of plants against her hip with one hand and waving enthusiastically with the other. Elora waved back. I'll be done soon, Asha yelled, turning away and walking toward the greenhouse. Elora couldn't help but smile, her fears and worries melting away at the clear excitement from Asha. It was going to be fine. She laid down in the grass, looking up at the soft clouds, parting to let the yellow, almost sunset light through. Another wave of tiredness hit her, making her eyelids drift shut. In some ways, today had seemed so short, but in other ways it seemed very long, and it was certainly eventful. Now, laying in the soft clover by the stream, warmed by some of the last rays of the sun, and without an annoying cat clawing her, she felt at peace, able to sink into the warmth. "Elora, your face," a soft, gentle, worried voice said. Elora opened her eyes to see Asha bent over her, intensely concerned. "I'm all right. I've had it tended to," Elora said, a bit mumbly and groggy. The sky was red now, not yellow anymore. How long had she slept? Asha slowly reached out, brushing her fingertips over Elora's cheek. Her gentle touch tingled against Elora's skin, and she felt heat rush to her cheeks. "What happened?" Asha asked, still clearly concerned. Elora blushed even more, suddenly embarrassed. "I flew into a wall." But Asha didn't laugh. She brushed Elora's hair back so she could see her forehead. "I know you said it's been tended already, but can I help some?" Elora nodded, her words all but taken away at the gentle care. Asha opened up one of several pouches on her waist. She laughed slightly. "I suppose it's a good thing I didn't stop to change out of my work clothes." Elora pulled out a few leaves and a small purple flower. From another pouch she got 2 palm-sized stones, one with a shallow divot in the middle. Elora pushed herself up into a sitting position to watch. Asha put the leaves and the flower in the divot, and then rubbed the 2 rocks together, frequently pausing to readjust the plants with a finger, and kept grinding until it was a paste. It smelled sharp and a bit earthy. "It won't be quite as good as it could be," Asha said. "I haven't learned enough yet about pulling the magic from the plants, so it's just their natural properties, but it should still help." Elora nodded quickly, practically in awe. "I'm sure it'll be very helpful." Asha smiled at her. Even with the residual sadness and concern in her face, she just looked so bright. The fading red light on her dark skin was just beautiful. Elora felt filled up with a feeling she couldn't name, but it made her feel pleasantly warm and very happy. She closed her eyes as Asha dabbed the paste gently onto the bruise. Asha was so gentle it didn't hurt at all, just sent tingles running through her. Maybe she was actually glad that she'd run into the wall. Asha pulled her hand away, and it felt over, and yet not over, because Elora got to open her eyes and see her again. "I brought food," Elora blurted out suddenly, feeling her cheeks heat even more with the outburst. Asha smiled brightly. "I'd love to try it." Asha stood up, wiping her hand and her stones on her apron, and then shook out a folded blanket that she must have brought and set on the ground next to the basket. "I didn't make it," Elora said quickly, somehow taken over by the impulse to babble whatever came into her mind. "I asked the cook to make it for me." Asha smiled, sitting on the blanket while Elora unpacked the basket. "It looks lovely. The cook must be a very generous person." "She is," Elora said, sitting next to Asha and opening the containers. They ate in silence for a bit, watching the sun finally slip behind the distant mountains. "Were you able to finish your project?" Asha asked, turning to look at Elora. "Oh, the harp. Not quite, actually, though I'm very close." "Oh, it's a harp?" Elora nodded. Well, I wanted to finish it and show you first, but I ended up sidetracked today. Would you want to hear about it, even if you can't see it yet?" She felt she could trust Asha not to tell anyone, if she knew it was a secret. Asha nodded eagerly. "Yes, I'd love to." Elora grinned, excited to finally tell someone. "Oh, but you can't tell anyone else. It's still a bit of a secret, just 'cause, well, I'm not really supposed to mess with magical things. I don't really have training, but I do know what I'm doing. I've researched it a lot." Asha nodded, her face becoming just a bit grim. "And if I keep it a secret, nothing's going to happen that could hurt anyone, right?" Elora shook her head firmly. "No, this can't hurt anyone." "All right. Then yes, I would enjoy hearing." Her smile returned, and she shifted to fully face Elora. Elora grinned again. "So it starts with, well, me, kind of. I think I'd have to explain about what happened to me first for you to understand." Asha frowned slightly, more in thought than anything else, and nodded. So... Elora realized she'd never really told anyone this particular story. Not anyone that wasn't involved or already knew something about it. It felt rather private. But it was here, in the dark, with only Asha. And she trusted Asha already. Perhaps she shouldn't, but she did. "Well, when I was young, Asha set a hand over hers. You don't have to tell me if it's a sensitive subject. I'm fine if you just begin with, for reasons I can't explain, I was doing this. Elora felt as if she might tear up. Asha was such a sweet person. No, I want to. It's just a little complicated knowing where to start. But I do want to tell you, 'cause we're friends? Asha very suddenly hugged her, and just as quickly let go. Oh, sorry, you've been so friendly to me, and I've barely known you a day or two, but I shouldn't have just... Elora hugged Asha back, suddenly filled with conviction. We're friends, she said firmly, though there was a piece at the back of her mind that said no. But not less than friends. More than friends. Or at least, a hope for more than friends. They both held on this time, finding something together they hadn't had in a long, long time. Asha was so nice to hug, Elora thought. She was round and soft, and it just felt so warm and safe and right. Suddenly there was a very loud and obvious gasp. Elora turned to see Millie staring at them open-mouthed. Elora, you've finally found someone! Elora knew that Millie certainly wasn't thinking friends. Millie didn't have anyone courting her ever since the boy she'd liked had gone traveling, and because of that she was determined to see romance everywhere it could be found, and many places where it could not. Asha seemed to understand this, even without knowing those details. She let go of Elora and spoke clearly and firmly, though not unkindly. You are being rather intrusive. Millie gasped again. Oh, I am. Sorry. She ran off, but Elora knew that the rumors would certainly be spread. Asha looked like she was holding herself in. She looked at her lap and nodded at Elora, seeming rather shy for the first time since they'd met. Friends, right? She asked quietly. It's nothing against you. I promise. You're lovely, but I don't... She looked up, firmness set in her eyes again. I don't like people that way. And I don't think I ever will. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up in vain. Elora nodded very seriously. I understand. It felt a bit... She'd expected to feel disappointed, but she didn't somehow. I think... Well, Millie gossips a lot. It may start a rumor, but I don't expect anything from you. This evening has been amazing. If you're comfortable with friends like we have been just now, I'm very happy with that. Asha nodded firmly, and then let out a kind of wheezing laugh, deflating and laying down on the blanket. Sorry, I think I took that too seriously, but I really don't want to have people upset at me for things I can't control. Elora reached out this time to put a hand over Asha's. No, I'm glad you told me clearly. I like knowing where we're going. She offered a small smile. Asha smiled back. There was a pleasant silence for a few minutes, just the sounds of crickets starting up their nighttime noises, and the soft babbling of the little stream. It was still warm and pleasant, and the moon could now be seen peeking through the branches of the big tree that shaded one corner of the greenhouse. Would you still want to tell your story? Asha asked. Elora laid down, looking up at the few stars beginning to appear, trying to think of how to start it again. Well, you know how some of the professors here have familiars? I've heard of it, Asha said. Most familiars are or were magical to begin with. It works best for circulating the magic somehow. I've heard some people say that the cat Azar has used to be a fairy. There was a soft rustle as Asha nodded. But it's hard to catch a magical creature, even harder to turn them into a familiar. So, when I was younger, a witch thought it would be easier to use a human. Easier than catching something magical, and much better than using an animal. According to her, I've always had a spark of magic in me. Elora shrugged. I'd certainly never felt it. But when it was a hard time for our family, she didn't even tell my parents what the potion would do, just paid them to make me drink it. And it didn't work, not completely, or else I'd be an owl. A heaviness grew in her chest as she spoke about it, but not as heavy as it used to be. It was as if telling the story unwound some of the pain of it. My parents were horrified, and my dad took me and ran away, but the part of the magic that did work properly made a bond between me and her, and I kept running back when she called me, even though I hated it. Asha took her hand and silently squeezed it. Elora squeezed back. They had to send me away up here, 'cause the school's protective wards blocked the bond between us, and she isn't allowed in. A knot came up in her throat. I miss them." Elora was silent a moment, and then pressed on with the much lighter and easier part of her story. "But ever since then, I can feel if something's magical if I touch it." Elora gestured at the stream beside them. "And I was walking along this little stream, but farther up, close to the edge of the school property, and I saw something in the water. I was curious, and I pulled it out, but I would have dropped it right back in if I hadn't felt the magic in it. It was a bone. A collarbone, I think, but not the same as a human's, and it just—" Elora waved her free hand, trying to find the right words. "It wants. I still don't know what exactly, but I researched a long time, and I found an old story of a harp made from a bone that told the story of the person's death when it was played. And this bone just wanted so badly, and I could feel it, so I started trying to figure it out." Elora chuckled lightly in remembrance. "The hardest part was making the rest of the harp, not the strings. I've only been working on strings for a few weeks, but it took months of trying to find out what it wanted the rest of the harp to be made out of. I finally found some wood that worked, and it turned out it used to be a baby cradle, but the cradle had broken and they couldn't fix it, so they were just selling the wood. And then the pins to hold the strings weren't so hard, but I think it already knew that it wanted the strings to be made of hair, because every pin had to have been a hairpin at one time, and just like the hair, they had to be freely given." "How did you figure out what it wanted and what it didn't?" Asha asked. "Mostly through feeling it. I don't know how to explain how it feels, just right or wrong, or somewhere like a grudging acceptance." Elora's mouth quirked up. "Or sometimes, especially with the wood I was trying to use at first, it would just fall apart." "So then when you finish it and you play it, you think it'll talk?" Asha asked, turning her head towards Elora. Elora shrugged, staring into the sea of stars. "Maybe not talk. I think in the story the harp just didn't make any sound until the bard started playing the song it wanted." "What if you can't find the right song?" Elora frowned slightly. "I don't know. I think it's taken time, but I've gotten this far. I think I'll be able to finish." Asha rolled onto her side to fully face Elora. "And then what?" Elora turned her head to meet Asha's gaze. "I really don't know. I can't leave here, even if it wants me to. Maybe I'll pass it on to someone who's leaving, let them continue the quest in a way." Asha yawned. "Perhaps, if it found you here, what it wants is here." "I hope so," Elora said quietly, the longing for something more panging through her. She'd kept it pressed down, sated with the excitement of making the harp, but she didn't know what she'd do once the harp was done, especially if she really did give it up. She felt for Asha's hand again, and Asha squeezed gently, rubbing a thumb over her fingers. Maybe she did have the more she'd been looking for already. Chapter 4. Elora tied the final string and tightened it carefully. There was a thrum, almost but not quite tangible, that pulsed from the harp. Elora grinned and strummed gently. The sound wasn't like anything she'd expected, certainly not from a harp. It was like the thrum, this time audible, and vibrating through the harp, and yet not sounding at all musical. She looked around to see if there was any effect on anything in her room. It didn't seem that there was, unless the effect was very slight. She flapped her wings and tested moving around, determining that there was no effect to herself either. She strummed again at the harp, and it seemed that the strings were stronger this time, the sound a bit louder, more resonant. Still not quite musical, though. More like a monotone hum than anything else she could name. She strummed it a third time, but it seemed that whatever change had happened was done. It didn't feel any different this time. She jumped as her door opened without even a knock, but no one was there. There was a small mew that drew her gaze down to see a cat, rubbing against the doorframe. "You scared me," Elora scolded lightly, frowning at the cat. It tipped its head to the side, blinking slowly at her, and Elora recognized it then as Azar's familiar. "Oh, did you hear the harp?" He certainly was a smart cat, and with his connection to Azar might well be able to sense magic too. The cat meowed again, staring at her far more intently than a normal animal would have. Elora strummed the harp again, but the cat just blinked at her and then turned around and left. She sighed, disappointed. Perhaps it had been more of a coincidence than she'd thought. Unless— "Wait! Don't tell Azar!" she whispered loudly, running to the door. The cat flicked his tail at her, looking back blandly. Please?" She tried looking at him pleadingly. The cat just turned and trotted away again. She tried not to worry. It was only a cat, and probably couldn't really speak. But she'd be in a lot of trouble if anyone found out she was making the harp. Had already made it. She decided quickly, hiding the harp under her pillow and running in the same direction the cat had gone, hoping to catch him before he reached Azar. To her surprise, the moment she turned the corner, the cat was sitting there waiting. As soon as she caught up, though, he ran ahead again. She chased the cat along the hallways, not quite fast enough to catch or corner him. "Oh, come on, please stop," she pleaded, tired of running and hoping that the cat really did understand speech. The cat did stop, meowing loudly and sitting in front of the door. Elora panted, leaning against the wall. "What, were you leading me here?" "It wasn't anywhere special. The students' bedrooms were up ahead, but there wasn't anything here. The door was probably just a closet." The cat meowed again, pawing at the door. Elora wondered if it really was something or just a mouse, until she heard a small shh. There was someone in there. Someone who knew the cat and didn't want him to be meowing and pawing at the door. Elora knocked gently at the door, but there was no response other than a quiet rustle. She narrowed her eyes, staring down the door and trying to figure out if it was worth it to open it. "Hello?" she said first, pitching her voice to be light, friendly, and a little curious. Elora decided, on receiving no answer, to open the door. It really was a closet, full of linens, but the bottom few shelves had been removed, and the linens that had been on them were arranged into a nest, inside of which was sitting a boy, staring up at her in alarm and worry. He was the same one she'd been seeing recently, apparently not only studying here sneakily, but also staying here without the knowledge of the teachers. Elora sighed. What was she supposed to do about this now? She knew too much to keep letting it go. "Please don't tell anyone," he whispered hoarsely. He was biting down hard on his lip, and his chin trembled slightly. Elora sat down on the ground, not surprised to see the cat go right to the boy and curl up in his lap. "I won't," she said, sighing again, "but I'd like to know what exactly is going on." He looked down at the cat, petting him slowly and chewing on his lower lip. He was getting ready to lie, that was plain. But he was young, probably close to 13. She didn't blame him for unsubtle tactics, though she was going to try and get the truth from him. "Why don't we start with your name? I think you've heard mine is Elora." His forehead creased, and he shook his head, eyes still fixed down into his lap. Elora frowned in confusion. "You won't tell me your name?" He shifted awkwardly, looking almost shy, before mumbling, "You can call me Keon." The phrasing, though mumbled, with a word or two dropped out, hit her as familiar, and took only a few more seconds to click. She huffed and crossed her arms. "Just because I look strange doesn't mean I'm a fairy. They wouldn't let any fairies in here anyway. No one's taking your name." He just shrugged slightly, curling in on himself. Elora held out a hand. "How about you come with me and we'll get some breakfast and you can tell me why you're here, okay?" He looked up suspiciously. "You won't tell anyone?" "No," Elora said firmly. "I'll see what I can do to help you. Hiding in a closet won't last forever." He frowned stubbornly, but finally stood, ignoring her offered hand. The cat meowed at them, curling up in the linens, apparently to go to sleep. "So, are you here just for the classes, or to learn something specific?" Elora asked, trying to infuse a bit of a lighter tone into the conversation. Keon didn't seem to think it lightened anything, hunching his shoulders. "I'm looking for a way to find someone." Elora nodded slowly. "Oh, so that's why you were looking into Ephior." Ephior was known, among other things, for having lost or misplaced many of his creations. It was speculated that, had he been able to make the tracking spell earlier in his life, the abilities of magic users would have advanced 10 or 20 years from his discoveries alone. Elora had often wished she could have met him. Keon nodded. "But I don't have what I'd need to use his search spell." Elora considered it for a few moments. "Perhaps there's a less powerful spell you could learn more easily?" He shook his head. "He's been missing for years. A small spell wouldn't work." "He? Who are you looking for?" Keon narrowed his eyes suspiciously at her. "I'm not saying." Elora felt a prickle of annoyance. "Keon, you're a kid. Looking for someone who went missing years ago when you were an even smaller kid. You don't have an adult with you, and are hiding in a school full of magic, and I'm sure they won't be happy to find out about that. You need help, and I really can't do much if you don't tell me anything. Keon bristled. I was doing perfectly fine by myself. I don't need you. Stubborn. Elora decided to try another way. I don't think Azar's familiar would have led me to you if you didn't really need any help. Keon frowned intensely, glowering down at the floor. I can't tell you who he is without telling the whole thing, and I don't trust you enough to tell you everything. Elora reluctantly nodded. It was at least more understandable. Well, then at least, so I can help you find a spell, is he a friend? Family? If it's your dad, that would narrow down things quite a bit. There's a lot of spells for finding missing fathers. Keon shook his head. My brother, kind of. I think the magic would acknowledge him as my brother. Half-brother? Elora guessed. Keon shook his head, but didn't elaborate. They'd nearly reached the kitchen, so Elora didn't press the question. Instead, she tried to think of what kinds of searching spells she already knew of. Perhaps they could help her, too, figuring out what the harp wanted. There was one or two that came to mind, but those were more of the lost socks or needing directions type, and unlikely to work for something like a brother missing for several years, or a harp that just felt like it needed something. Keon sat across the table from her in the dining hall, mostly ignoring her as he wolfed down several bowls of oatmeal with far too much honey. Elora ate much more slowly, trying to remember the names of books where she'd seen search spells written about. She thought of 4, and a 5th was hovering on the edges of her mind, a book about getting favors from fairies, though she couldn't seem to recall the exact name. She was fairly certain she knew which shelf to look on, though. Then she abruptly remembered that the students were taking her job in the library for a few days, and while she might have the time to search for books, she very much did not want to run into them this soon, when they'd still be smarting from the assigned punishment. This certainly held up her plans of helping Keon. Perhaps she could just send him off with the titles for the books she knew, and hope it took him a few days to figure out whether he would get anything helpful from them? Even one more day, and it would likely be safer for her to go back into the library. And he didn't seem to need her company as much as her knowledge. But even still, now she knew he didn't even have a room, she was loath to leave him by himself for fear something would happen. There was the sound of a bell, and Keon stood up quickly. I have to get to class, he said, leaving his dishes and waving slightly as he caught up with the departing first years. Elora hadn't expected him to still go to classes, and was caught off guard, just managing a wave back as the crowd of young teens left the room. And that left her with nothing to do. No plans, at least. She could go back and see if there were any more changes or clues with the harp, or perhaps she could go and find Asha. Or, which seemed to her the best idea yet, she could get the harp and bring it with her to find Asha, and then show her once she was done with her work for the day. Fully decided, she carried hers and Keon's dishes back to the kitchen. Elora! The cook greeted, surprising her with an almost sly smile. I heard you had a good evening last night. Elora almost winced. She'd hoped Millie would wait at least a little without telling the entire staff her assumptions, but instead she smiled. Yes, I had a nice evening. Thank you so much for the picnic basket. The cook beamed. Maybe bring her inside for dinner sometime. If it's not too often, I can give you a little help from my end of things. She winked knowingly. Elora kept smiling, unsure how exactly to broach the I'm not dating Asha topic when the cook hadn't actually outright said that she was. She decided to glance off the topic in a similar way to the cook. I'll try to bring her. Perhaps she'll become friends with you all as well. The cook's face held a distinct note of confusion, but Elora turned and left, feeling very awkward and like she'd said entirely the wrong thing. Friends. Somehow, it didn't feel right. It did, but it also didn't. She knew enough to rule out dating as the term she was searching for, but friends also felt wrong, and she wasn't sure exactly why. Elora shook away the troublesome thoughts. She was going to show Asha her harp and enjoy spending time with her. That was enough for now. No need to get worked up over what that might be called. She went upstairs and put her apron on to hold the harp in. It should be safe there. Though, just to be safe, she wrapped it in a spare shirt first, so no one would be able to see what it was if they could see into the pocket. Now she just had to find Asha. She was probably somewhere on the grounds, and probably still at work or learning, but it should be okay for Elora to come watch, as long as she didn't distract Asha too much. The school grounds were pretty large, though, and Elora wasn't sure where to start looking. Well, a walk would be nice anyway. She left through a side door, and decided that she'd go to the greenhouses first. But Asha wasn't in either of them. She checked the food garden, close to the school buildings, and growing a variety of herbs and vegetables, but Asha wasn't there either. She went to the forest, or rather, the tiny corner of it on school grounds, where the underbrush of plants with magical properties was encouraged to grow. The groundskeeper was there, but without Asha. Thankfully, he was able to point her in the right direction. I sent her to the school nurses so she could bring some supplies to them and see what they're working with. He smiled kindly at Elora, and thankfully without that knowing smirk that most other people gave her when she asked if they'd seen Asha. The rumor mill was relentless. It had been just as bad when two of the professors had been seen hugging. To be fair, they were now in a relationship, so it had been correct in their case, but still. Was it not interesting enough around the school? Why did so many people feel the need to talk about potential relationships? Elora finally reached the nurse's office and knocked at the door. "Oh, hello," one of them greeted as he opened the door. "Wow, I guess you're coming in for that black eye, huh?" Elora had nearly forgotten about that with everything else. Not really. I actually came to see Asha. I was told she was here." He raised an eyebrow, but then shrugged. "Sure, she's over there. She's a bit busy, though. You may need to wait a while." Elora nodded with a small smile, and then went over to where he'd pointed. Asha glanced up, smiled, and then went back to writing in a notebook. She was standing in front of a wall of drawers and cabinets, one of which was open in front of her. Elora could see a yellowish-brown powder inside the tiny drawer. There were labels on all of them, scrawled in handwriting she couldn't decipher. Elora sat down in a chair nearby, more than content to watch Asha work. Until the thought hit her that it might be creepy to do that. She ought not to stare. But she enjoyed watching Asha, looking all confident and serious, though she didn't understand why. She'd only met Asha a few days ago, and now here she was, spilling all her secrets last night, and then now sitting and staring at her. Why did she like her so much and so fast? Was it just that Asha seemed genuinely kind and interested in her? If that was all it took, Elora shivered at the thought of someone using that to take advantage of her. Asha wouldn't do that, though. She was almost sure. Then again, she'd only known her a few days. She didn't know enough to be very sure. There were only assumptions and instincts and emotions. But they all pointed towards Asha being absolutely amazing. Elora glanced up from her lap, where she'd been staring at her hands while she mused, and caught a small grin from Asha. She grinned back, a warm rightness chasing away all her worries. Asha closed the drawer and opened the one next to it. "I'll be a bit. Do you want something to do?" Elora perked up. "Oh, is there a way I can help?" Asha nodded, her gaze fixed on what she was writing in her book. "I've been focused on noting the properties of these medicines, and I put off the organizing I was meant to do until the end. But if you want, I'm sure they wouldn't mind if you helped. If you look in some of these on that end, there's individual packets, and they need to be organized by date, with the oldest ones forward to be used first. Unless you come across any more than a year old, some of those need to go. You can show me, and I'll tell you whether they stay or not." Elora nodded intently. She could definitely do some organizing, especially if it helped Asha. "And if it's not in packets, just leave it for now, and hopefully I'll be done before then and I can take over again. Sound good?" Asha looked up from her book to see Elora's response. Elora nodded quickly. "Yeah, I can do that." Asha smiled in thanks, her round cheeks pushing her eyes half closed, all crinkly at the corners. She was so cute, and having it all directed at Elora made her feel warm and happy. She went right to work. It was interesting to see which of the medicines were magical. Not that they said so, but even with the paper of the packet between her and the powder, some of them made her fingers tingle. Most of them felt nice, but with some the zing was almost painful. They must be very powerful. Elora wondered what they were used for. And then she realized she could just ask. She held one up by the top of the packet, where she wasn't holding any of the medicine, just paper. "What's this one for?" Asha turned her head towards Elora, still looking at her book till she'd finished writing the sentence. "Which? Oh! That's actually one of the ones they used to help that student the other day. It's supposed to stop the effects of most ingested magic. It activates once it's been swallowed." "Seems pretty active already," Elora said, frowning at the packet. Asha looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Well, it stings, even through the packet." "Sting? Wait, you can feel the magic!" Elora said, far too loudly for a room with nurses nearby that could overhear. Elora covered Asha's mouth abruptly, trying to frown in a way that showed alarm and not anger. "Yes, but shh." Asha's eyes widened in understanding. "Sorry, I forgot," she mumbled past Elora's hand. Elora took her hand away slowly, trying to see if the nurses had heard. "Can you feel the magic of all of them, so I can write it down?" Asha asked in an excited whisper. "I can, but I can't tell you much about it other than how it feels." Asha nodded eagerly. "That'll be plenty. I'd love to have another person like you here and compare the differences in how you both feel it. But I can write it down, and I'll be sure to take this book with me when I leave, and I'll ask others who can feel magic so I can hear how it feels for them and compare them." The thought of Asha leaving stabbed into Elora's chest. "There's other people who can do it at the school," she offered, a bit weakly, and hoped it was disguised enough as just trying to be quiet. "Some of the older professors, and I'm sure there's a student or two that has inherent magic and could feel them." Asha was nodding excitedly, flipping to a different part of the book to write more. "Do you have any names you can give me? Or wait, first I want to know how you feel the magic, then names after. I'm so curious. What does that one feel like?" Elora considered, shaking off unpleasant thoughts of the future and focusing on happy, excited Asha now. "It stings, not quite as strong as a nettle, but it's continuous." "Okay, and which ones sting? I want to see if they're some of the ones I already grouped together." Asha's eyes were bright as she opened a drawer. "How about this one?" Elora picked up the packet. "Yes, this one does too. Not as strong, though." Asha started writing again very quickly. "That's interesting. I'd have thought it would be stronger. What about that one?" Elora picked it up and heard the door open. "It does a little, but it's also kind of warm." Asha nodded, serious and excited at once, flipping several pages before writing more. Elora heard a familiar voice grumbling, as if he'd come through the door while talking. "Fine, but they said I had to come get checked out. I don't need anything." Elora peeked around the side of the storage wall, surprised to see Keon holding his stomach. He looked more than a little pale. He'd been fine just a bit ago. What had happened? "Who is it?" Asha asked, also peeking out after she'd noticed Elora's attention was elsewhere. "His name is Keon. I kind of know him," Elora said. "I hope he's okay." "Well, I'm here to help," Asha said, walking out and over. "Hey there, what's the matter with your stomach?" Keon shrugged. "Just hurts some. I probably ate too much or something." "Why did they send you here?" Elora asked, despite it not being her place. Keon startled when he noticed her. "Why are you here?" "I came to find Asha. What happened?" He shrugged again, looking away sourly. "I threw up." "Are you okay?" Elora asked, concerned, and held out a hand to his forehead. There was a zing of something that ran through her, and that not quite audible thrum came from the harp in her apron. She jerked back, alarmed, but Keon looked almost more alarmed than she was. His mouth opened partly, but instead of speaking, he turned and ran. Chapter 5. Elora chased after him. "Keon, wait!" For a kid, he was fast, and didn't have to deal with the drag of her wings. She almost thought he'd get away, until he faltered, stopping a distance away. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, looking more afraid than angry, like his tone suggested. "Me?" Elora asked, completely confused. She didn't stop running, though, trying to catch up while he was still. "I didn't do anything, you did." "You did," Keon accused. "I know it. You meant it for me. You were just waiting till I let my guard down." "Why would you think that?" Elora asked, finally close to him. "Because it felt just like my mom's. You must have taken something from me earlier." He ran again, just before Elora could reach him. "I didn't," Elora insisted, getting out of breath from all the running and shouting. "I can't even do that kind of magic, much less that well." But now she knew he definitely could. He was magical somehow, more than even the oldest professors, almost like it was inherent in him. His suspicion about names came back to her. Maybe he hadn't thought she was part fairy. Maybe he was. But how had a fairy gone undetected here for so long? He'd been here at least a week, and there hadn't even been a rumor about him. He looked perfectly human, too. Elora forced herself to run faster. And the magic had felt like his mother? Why would her little ability to feel magic feel like... The harp. It had thrummed almost immediately, and he hadn't run until it did, though the idea of her having happened across his mother's bones made Elora shudder. Did he know that something had happened to his mother? "Keon, wait!" Elora called after him, very grateful that the halls were empty at that moment. If she would have had to dodge as well as chase, she would have surely lost him by now. "Only after you tell me what you did," Keon yelled back. But she hadn't done anything. Well, she'd done something. "I made a magic harp." She didn't think he would hear her, since she hadn't yelled, but he slowed significantly. "What does it do?" "I don't know," Elora gasped, thoroughly winded. "I was trying to find out." Keon stopped running, and Elora was finally able to catch up to him, gasping for air. Keon, on the other hand, while breathing hard, wasn't nearly as affected by the running. Her suspicion of him being a fairy, or at least partly, was getting more cemented by the moment. "What did you find out?" Keon asked, his tone icy and wary. Elora shrugged helplessly, gesturing at him. "You have something to do with it, apparently." He huffed, crossing his arms and frowning intensely. Elora was surprised to hear running steps behind her, and looked back to see Asha rounding the last corner that they'd run past. She hadn't realized Asha was following. Asha also didn't seem nearly as winded as she was, not having to fight to catch her breath. "What's going on?" "What's going on?" Keon exploded. "What's going on with the two of you? I keep running into you over and over, and just when I think it's fine and only a coincidence, you do some kind of magic targeted at me, and then chase me over half the school." "You aren't exactly being completely normal either," Elora accused lightly, wishing she had some water. Keon glared. "Why don't we find a place to actually talk this out?" Asha suggested, all gentle and calming. "We don't need yelling and accusations." Elora felt rather embarrassed. Asha was obviously right, but she hadn't expected even that light scolding. Keon also looked chided, though still defensive. Elora led the way to a close-by classroom, empty this year. It would have been used by the third years, but the class that year had been sparse, and this room was unneeded. Asha tugged 3 chairs into a loose circle, and sat in one. Elora sat, and then Keon, watching them suspiciously. Elora spoke first, trying to extend an olive branch. "If you explain why you're here, I'll tell you about the harp." Keon's expression suddenly changed. The defensiveness and anger faded away into the more confident, almost childish politeness Elora had seen first from him. "It's a deal, Asha, Elora, provided you promise that not a single detail of my story leaves this room." Elora glanced at Asha, who shrugged, equally confused, and they both nodded. The slightest twitch of a smug smile pulled at the corner of Keon's mouth, making Elora wonder what she was missing. "I was exchanged for a human when I was born," Keon said evenly. "I didn't know of it until a few years ago. I have no attachment to that family and little to my original family, but I would like to find my brother. He's likely in the fairy kingdom somewhere, but I can't get inside looking like this. I can't find the entrances, and no one will lead me. I was hoping to find a way to search for him. My birth mother, I've learned, was also searching for me. She was against the changing, but never succeeded in reversing the decision." Elora was feeling worse and worse about the story she had to tell. "I don't have the skills or nearly enough inherent power to force my way through to find either of them, so I was hoping to find something here that would let me get around that lack," Keon finished. He sat back in his chair, his mannerisms now the smooth confidence of one much older. "I think I may have found your mother, in a way," Elora said hesitantly. His gaze became very intent, revealing his calm and confidence to be a bluff. "As a part of the spell that gave me these," Elora said, rustling her wings slightly, "I can sense magic in things or people when I touch them, and sometimes I get an impression of a feeling when I do." Keon nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I found a bone in the stream here a while ago. I followed the impressions I got from it, and I made it into a harp. It responded when I touched you." Her face creased in pity. "It was the harp?" Keon asked, the words coming out in a weak breath. "And I thought this whole time the cat was leading me to you." "He was?" Elora said, confused. "Before today?" Keon nodded. "Several times. That's why I came to ask you for help with the book I couldn't find." "He really must be special," Elora mused. "Of course it is. It used to be a fairy. Not too much left in that head anymore, but enough. Whatever Azar did to it must have been awfully powerful." Keon sounded both unsettled and impressed. She'd suspected something like that, but the confirmation was still a lot to take in. "Can I hold the harp?" Keon asked, holding out his hands. Elora nodded silently, still thinking about the cat, and about herself, and about the other pets and familiars there were in the school, what that might mean about what, or who, they used to be. She held out the harp to Keon. He held it in 2 hands and stared at it, turning it around to see all the parts of it. He strummed lightly at the strings, and a musical sound finally came from it, drawing Elora's attention back. Keon strummed a few more times, experimenting with the placements of his fingers. Perhaps he already knew how to play harps. Perhaps it was magic. Perhaps some of both. But a song flowed out of it like water, filling the room almost palpably, making Elora feel like she was floating in it, a warm rain pattering somewhere above her head. Abruptly, the song stopped. Elora blinked and looked at Keon, who was holding his hand against the strings so they couldn't make any more sound, and was blinking hard as if to stop himself from crying. It was clear to her then. The harp wasn't her story. It was Keon's. She was a side character, meant to support and spur him forward to find his brother. He could have it. Even with all the time she dedicated to the harp, she didn't feel at all bad about giving it away. Her story would come in its time, and this could well be a part of it. Perhaps they'd meet again. "You know the song?" Asha asked gently. Keon nodded, his chin dimpled and his lips pressed together tightly. "Keep the harp," Elora blurted. My mother lives in Keithias. She can help you too if you need. I'll write you a letter to give to her." "Keithias?" Keon asked, looking utterly bewildered, swiping a hand over his face. Elora nodded firmly. "There's a lot of hidden half-breeds in Keithias. You'll get better help from them than you will here. You might have to drop a few hints, and you will have to be careful, but there's good people there, but also a lot of bad people, and people willing to do a lot for money." Keon nodded, his eyes wet and red-rimmed, still looking confused. Elora turned to Asha. "If you ask the groundskeeper and I ask the cook, we can pack him a bag so he can go." "Why are you doing this?" Keon asked. You don't owe me anything. We haven't even made a deal except for keeping my story secret." A wave of emotion hit her, realizing she was giving up her biggest chance yet. But it wasn't really a chance for her, was it? There was no promise the harp would protect her if she left the school, and Keon didn't need her. It wasn't her adventure this time. It just wasn't. This was meant for you. Just if once you find your brother, and you're happy again, remember I'm stuck here. Keon seemed more confused than understanding, but he still nodded firmly. "I will." Elora stood up. She had the plan. She had to act. Now. Or the other side of her mind was going to swamp her in grief at losing what she'd been working so hard towards. She was barely aware of how she convinced the cook. Just a request for food that wouldn't quickly go back, and once she had a grudging agreement she was off again, ignoring the call behind her asking for more details. A letter to her mother asking her to help Keon, and with a brief "I'm doing well and I love you" at the end. As many of the directions as she could remember written on the envelope. She took a map from the library too, hoping it wouldn't be missed. They met, as if they'd planned it, though they hadn't, by the side of the school. Asha had a bit of food and medicine to offer, as well as a tincture that would make Keon unnoticed, should he need it, for a time. Keon already had a small pack, and Elora gave him what she'd collected. He'd hung the harp under his shirt, tied with a string around his neck. It was rather big for his small frame, the print of it obvious under his shirt. "Good luck," Elora said, her voice thick. Keon nodded, eyebrows furrowed. "Thank you. I hadn't expected much help from well, I guess you aren't exactly human, are you?" Elora shrugged, wishing he'd go quickly. Her eyes were prickling and her lip trembled. "You're welcome. I hope you find him quickly." Keon thanked Asha also, turning away. "There's a farmer," Asha called after him. "She makes a loop every week. If you get to the main road before sunset, you should come across her and get a ride several miles to the first town." "Thank you," Keon called back for the last time. Something dripped off Elora's chin. Keon gradually walked out of sight, beyond where Elora could follow. Asha turned back, smiling slightly, but her smile fell immediately when she met Elora's eyes. Elora's chin shook, another tear slipping down her face. Asha caught her in a hug, and Elora's knees buckled. She buried her face in Asha's shoulder, unable to stop herself from sobbing any longer. I'll have another chance," she forced out. Asha rubbed her back, holding her close. "I'm sure you will. It's not not over now. I can still leave someday. Asha hugged her tightly. Yes, you will. I'll help you. I'll find something else, Elora cried, breaking down completely. Epilogue. Elora sat on the edge of her bed to be a bit higher up, Asha sitting between her legs on the floor. She put a little more of the oil on her fingertips, massaging it into Asha's hair. She still felt like she wasn't doing it quite right, even after several attempts the past few weeks, but Asha always assured her she was doing well, and certainly seemed to be enjoying herself. She was leaning back against Elora, her eyes closed, and a small, sleepy smile on her face. Tonight, when Elora was finished, Asha wanted to try doing something similar to her, but to her wings. Elora wasn't sure if it would be too much oil, but it certainly sounded like it would feel very nice. She could always just bathe if it turned out to be too much oil for her feathers. She was really happy. She hadn't felt so happy in a long time. She still wanted to be able to leave the school, but with Asha here, she didn't feel the need nearly as pressing. She could be patient and wait for the right time. And Asha was staying for months for her learning, and had promised to stay even longer if they hadn't found a way for Elora to leave before then. There was just one thing still that gnawed at the back of her mind. Asha, I wanted to talk with you about something, Elora said hesitantly. Asha opened her eyes, tilting her head up to look at Elora. So, you know how we're friends? Asha frowned slightly. Yes. This isn't friends to me. I don't expect anything else from you. Actually, I know you were just wanting friends, so if you aren't okay with this, I'd understand that. But I really like the relationship we have, and I want it to stay like it is. Just what it is, it's not what I'd call friends. Elora couldn't keep looking Asha in the face. She stared instead at her blanket. What would you call it? Asha asked, her voice very neutral and not giving away what she was thinking. I don't know, Elora admitted. It's not like I want to marry you, but I like how this is. A lot. And I don't think I'd have a relationship like this with anyone else. Asha slowly nodded. I think I might understand you. If this won't grow into something where you want marriage. And you won't want me to kiss you, right? Not even in the future? Elora shook her head immediately. Definitely not if you'd be uncomfortable with it. I have sometimes wanted to kiss your forehead, but if you don't want that, I won't. Asha looked very thoughtful. I don't want that. Not now, at least. Elora nodded quickly. But I guess if you're okay with me not wanting this to go there, and you stay okay with that, I'm okay with you not seeing this as friends. Elora sagged in relief. Asha's thoughtful look grew softer. It's just a different kind of love. There's a lot more kinds, I think, than most people say. Elora agreed. A different kind of love. Asha smiled, and the gnawing in the back of Elora's mind melted into a puddle of happiness. She started massaging Asha's head again. Yes, with Asha and her different kind of love, she'd be very happy even if it took her a long time to get out of here. Author's note. Thank you for reading. I hope you enjoyed Elora and Asha, my lovely Ace and Arrow darlings. At this time, there's another book written in the same universe, though it's not a direct sequel, and it's in the editing process. You can email me at kyralayson@gmail.com for updates about future books or to talk about this one. I love hearing what people have to say, and I may be willing to offer sneak peeks for future books. To see what I'm doing or to support me financially, check out coffee.com/kyralayson.